I want to share a subject of which I have some interest. If you look back on some of my YouTube or TikTok, you'll see some videos on how I was raised and how it affected me as an adult. It's always been a subject of great interest to me. Picking that apart, I ended up with some, I would say, just kind of minor mental illness when I was younger, when it came to this kind of stuff, like the toxic household that I was raised in. So I spent a lot of time in my adult years trying to figure that out. I ended up going to school, of which I'm currently in, for psychology and sociology, just so I could figure that out. So one subject that came up that is actually quite embarrassing to me, and it's a good idea sometimes to let things like this be public, but it's a subject called emotional incest. Now, I don't want anybody to get confused with this, because the word incest, please realize it is an indirect term. This term, I'll just go ahead and define it right off the bat. Emotional incest, also known as covert incest, is a type of emotional abuse that occurs when a parent or caregiver treats a child as a romantic partner, seeking emotional support from them that would normally come from another adult. This relationship is inappropriate and unfair to the child, but it does not involve physical or sexual intimacy. Just keep that in mind when it comes to this subject, because some words are taboo with human beings, one of them being incest. But my mother in particular would go absolutely nuts with anger and rage if she knew this, that I had this idea. And actually, what would make her very upset is that it's true. Now, in my particular case, my father took a hike on us emotionally and physically. He was still my father, and I still had to follow his rules, but he wasn't there. He was certainly not there at all emotionally or mentally even. My father was not a person who gave advice very well. He was actually very mean and unsavory. Very difficult for a child to grow up around, but I did manage, and people around him did manage, even though the world ended up being a better place after he died. My father also, that goes without saying, took an emotional hike on my mother. And my father was a hunter. That was his hobby. So what he did is he went into the woods to escape all of his responsibilities that he didn't want to face. So he left my mother there in a marriage where she didn't have anybody to talk to. And if he was there, I don't think he'd be much of a conversationalist anyway. So my sister is 7 years older than me. You can always ask her any of this. She can attest to any of this. We've talked in depth about all of it. It's something that, I don't know, you'd have to ask her and see what the emotional incest. I really don't think my mother looked at my sister in that way. But that's a story for another day. My father took a hike emotionally on my mother, so my sister was 7 years older than me. So right about the time when my sister moved out, my father had taken a real big hike, because they had a lot of problems in the household when my sister became an adult. And I was 11 and sitting there with my mother, and that's when my mother laid it in on me. And I will say in her defense, in a very minor way, that there was nobody else around. It was me and her, and we used to do things together. And don't get me wrong, it was a mother-son. We just did everything together. We were the only ones there. There were many, many mother and son things that were very normal, other than this behavior. Now, this behavior caused me at 11, when I was sitting there talking to my mother about really deep subjects as it pertained to my sister and her very adult relationships, and why she moved out, and the fights that they had, and my father and the way he was, and so on and so forth. All at the end of it, my father comes home and mentally abuses us some more. So then he leaves and we talk again, so went to the grocery together. I went to the grocery with my mother. I went to stores with my mom. My mother inherently spoiled me. So it was very easy to fall into. Now, it probably would have been better if my mother would have made the decision to not lay a lot of those things on an 11-year-old. It had its pros and its cons with me, but I think it caused me to grow up too fast in a lot of ways, and I think it caused me to learn a little bit too much about human beings too fast. It actually ended up being my Achilles heel when I got older. The fact that I paid way too much attention to human behavior. And you can see what my majors have been in college, and my constant quest for understanding my mental illness when it comes to how I grew up. So maybe my mother should have taken a little bit of time as an adult to think about her son, and maybe not do that and find another adult to lay that on to, because that caused me a myriad of problems. And I hope if anybody else had to deal with this, then maybe they got over it. I got over it when I was in my 40s, so good luck. Examples of emotional incest: oversharing details about romantic relationships with a child. My mother never did that, like over romantic, never talked about like her and my father's romantic relationships. She did talk about like her intimate relationship as far as her daughter and her. That was always a big subject. She had these journals and she would just pour her heart out, and she would like kind of read them to me, you know. Discussing marital problems with the child. She didn't go over my father's stuff very much, just my sister's, and that was really the time. Putting the parents' emotional needs before the child, that for sure, man. She would cry and wail and moan, and I would feel real bad for her, I remember, and I was really powerless to do anything about it. I'm sure she did talk about my father, but maybe I didn't understand. But I do remember sitting there and feeling real bad for my mother going through what she went through. Favoring traits like loyalty and independence over independence and initiative. That is my mother to a T. Loyalty and independence, that's exactly what she wanted, and she did not foster independence and initiative. If I was around her now, she wouldn't. She gets her claws into people and she won't let them go. Thinking of the child as an extension of themselves or a future caregiver. Oh my gosh. I have a theory on whether you should, I mean, I would suppose that you would like your parents if you were going to take care of it. But it seems like from the moment me and my sister were walking around, they were trying to secure their places as me taking care of them. Me and my sister taking care of them when they were infirm. That's all they seemed to care about. Not that I wouldn't have been happy to do it, but it's all they cared about. Signs that a child may experience emotional incest include feeling like they have to care for parents' emotional needs always. The parent reacting with jealousy or panic when the child has a close friendship or romantic partner. It does involve the parent. Huge. My mother always freaked out. She actually freaked out when me and my sister had a relationship. She firmly got between me and my sister all the time. She hated it. The child saying the parent is her best friend, but also feeling obligated to be there for him, and sometimes hating them. Yes. Ignoring their own needs to favor the parents. Yes, I did this with both my parents, even though my father never gave me any payback for anything. Missing out on activities that are appropriate for children, like time with for friends or extracurriculars. There seemed to actually be a pretty decent balance of that when it came to my mother. She did balance it. I did those things too. Feeling responsible for emotions of others, absolutely. I still have that, and I really need to let it go. I feel absolutely responsible for how other people feel all the time. All the time. People-pleasing behaviors, yes. Capital Y-E-S. Alternating feelings of love or hatred for the parent, yes. And now I finally alternated to, and that's what's funny, not hatred. I do not hate my mother. My father's dead. I do not hate my mother for what she did. She made some mistakes, but the biggest problem with my mother is that she never atoned for her behavior once. She never apologized for anything. She really just got more upset and more violent and more belligerent when you tried to ask for love.